Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Maple League host session. This is a series that we bring in external speakers to the Maple League every month this summer. And today we are so pleased to feature the 2020 Canadian ISSoTL Fellows. They will be talking about the Joy Quotient and how SoTL, that's the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, can help make your teaching even better than before the post-pandemic era. So I would like to introduce our three panelists today. We have Mandy from York University, Melanie from Lethbridge College, and Pat from Nipissing University. And I will let them talk a little bit about SoTL and their roles, and then in the second part of this panel, we will open it up to a Q&A. Before we begin, we would just like to acknowledge that we are built on the Maple League of Universities. All four campuses are built on lands of Indigenous peoples, of the Abenaki people in the Wabanaki Confederacy at Bishops, and unceded Mi'kmaq territory at Acadia, Mount Allison, and St. Francis Xavier. So it's important for us to acknowledge that our learning is taking place on Indigenous lands. And now I would like to start with our first question for our panelists. And I will pass it over to Mandy to answer this one, and then we can cycle through. So Mandy, in your institution and everyone's institutional roles, how do you support SoTL and SoTL-related initiatives?
Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you for having me here. So at the Teaching Commons, which is York University's Teaching and Learning Support Center, so we have a very small crew of educational developers, and we have a couple of postdocs as well as an instructional designer as well. Across the educational developer roles, until sort of with pandemic, where a lot of our roles started to resemble each other's much more in terms of the support of teaching remotely and online learning and what that was. But primarily my role as a developer has been to support the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning by doing it and trying to contribute to the literature, but primarily as engaging with somebody who is supporting staff who are, first of all, learning. For many who are learning about SoTL and about how to do SoTL, the benefits of engaging in this type of research and field of inquiry, and then supporting them through the research process. So from my perspective, that's super fun, and it's really kind of great to watch them. For those who enter in from what is this? I think I like it. I'm not sure if I do. And then when they emerge with having some extraordinary data that they didn't foresee being possible, that's so fantastic. But in terms of the specific initiatives, other than sort of like one-on-one consultations and those kinds of things that are probably familiar to many who are in teaching and learning centers, I lead a course where we do support faculty, those who teach in any kind of a capacity in doing their own SoTL-based research. And so that's my pride and joy within the Teaching Commons.
Thanks, Mandy. And I would like to pose that question to Pat, and then after Melanie, who is only joining us by audio right now.
Great, thanks, Heather. I guess from my perspective, it is very similar to Mandy's in that we have a teaching hub at Nipissing University, and that's a brand new center, kind of brand new, slightly older than the virtual Maple League Teaching and Learning Center. We had our soft launch on February 6th, and then a month later had to close everything down. So we have a teaching hub to which I, as the Dean of Teaching, play an administrative role within that. I'm the inaugural Dean of Teaching at Nipissing University, and really we have some strategic outcomes. There's sort of 4 R's, not reduce, reuse, recycle, but recognition, resource, relationships, and research. And I think SoTL really crosses across all of those, because at Nipissing University we've got this great basis for thinking about teaching, wanting to be great teachers, and that comes out of our where Nipissing University came from, starting in education. And we just need to celebrate it more and inspire. And to me, that's a part of SoTL. We need to resource, and we need to do We need to resource our faculty members in their teaching with evidence-based best practices. And so that comes into resources. We need to build relationships. I think one of the strongest things that we've seen, particularly now in the pandemic context, is, we need to do things as a small institution with others that allow us to be better together. And I know that that's a moniker used many different places. And then finally, that R of research, that's quite obviously SoTL related, and that's us as an institution encouraging instructors to think about what they do, why they do it, and document that versus sort of just letting these great learnings either only happen anecdotally or float off into the ether as a missed opportunity. So in my institutional role as a dean, it's sort of administrating those strategic pieces to all come together.
Perfect. And now over to you, Melanie.
Hi, I'm Mel Hamilton, and I'm from Lethbridge, Alberta. And I'm an educational developer at Lethbridge College, and I run our Scholarship of Teaching and Learning research program. And so I have a little bit of a different viewpoint because from a college perspective, we're not mandated to do any type of research, and we're 100% our workload's 100% teaching. So we really tried to facilitate, or in the last few years, our program has really tried to facilitate teachers taking a step back and thinking and celebrating what they already do in the classroom, which is fabulous. And then once we get them to identify what they're doing in the classroom and show them that they can share it with others, then we'll get them to go into our SoTL grant program. And that's where our instructors can apply for a $7,000 grant, which gives them release time and a research assistant to kind of help them through the project. What makes our grant super unique is it's a capacity building grant, and we're trying not to make it competitive, meaning that even with the application process, we'll help them from the beginning to the end so that they can see successes and little wins along the way. And then we also will help them throughout their whole entire research process, whether it's doing their lit review or if they're having trouble trying to get a research question out there, we'll kind of help them. So we really wrap ourselves around our SoTL researchers all the way through to dissemination. And if they're uncomfortable when they get to the dissemination phase, we'll actually go to conferences with them and stand up there and kind of be a second set of hands when they're presenting. And so far, we've had 18 researchers go through our grant program, and every single one of them has disseminated. So they've all come to completion, which is a huge success for us. I'm also the chair of SoTL Canada and the vice president Canada for the ISSoTL. And so my SoTL journey is to bring people into the party and to show everybody that the SoTL party, whether you're a newbie to SoTL or you've done a lot of SoTL projects, that there's a place for everybody in this SoTL continuum. And that we hope, like the three of us as ISSoTL fellows, really hope that you know that you can reach out to us anytime to support us with your SoTL journey.
Thanks so much for that. And I think it is really important and really interesting to recognize that we have three fantastic leaders here who all are at different stages in their careers and different roles. So continuing with that train of thought, and I'll pass it right back to you, Melanie, and then maybe Pat and Mandy. How does the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning bring you joy?
Well, I think the biggest thing for me when I call myself an accidental researcher, and I'm a nurse by trade and thought I'm never going to research and I'm just going to teach nursing in the classroom, and I was content with that. But one of the things I noticed I was doing was always finding better ways to teach the students and to have student outcomes. And when I finally found that there was a title to what I was doing, I was amazed that I'm like, maybe I am doing research after all. So then taking that epiphany and this aha moment and showing other people, whether they're, like I said, at the beginning phases or in their discipline, is to say that you can do it too, and take your good ideas and celebrate them. So my biggest joy is when people have that same aha moment and feel like I can do this research and I'm doing a really good job, and celebrating them, because then it shows that their passion for their students and the outcome for their student experiences is what is important to them.
Perfect. And Pat, what about you?
I think for me, what brings me joy about SoTL is that inspirational piece, and that inspirational piece that just comes from all kinds of different avenues. And just like my, the center that I have at Nipissing University is the teaching hub. I really feel like that hub, and I feel inspired to be that hub in terms of learning what others are doing, whether that's internationally or at my institution, supporting them in that whatever role, whatever way they accidentally stumble into SoTL, and then showcasing for others that evidence-based practice. So in my different roles, it's the joy of hearing about something because I'm the chair of the Council of 3M Fellows, and linking that to Joe Smith, average biology prof at my own institution, or it's about figuring out that having edited the Journal of Experiential Education for 6 years, all the cool stuff that's going on there in business or in architecture or in outdoor education, and spreading it around to other disciplines or other colleagues, and really just bring showcasing, celebrating the local to the global and bringing the global into the local. And that really brings me joy when I can be that conduit for, how SoTL matters to all levels.
Thanks, Pat. And Mandy.
Okay, so I'm all about the academic hugs, and I've hashtagged this on Twitter, and I mean this broadly, and while it does sound quite silly, and that's okay, I don't mind that. I think that there's a lot of truth that drives what we do with regards to our work in every way possible when it comes to how we feel supported, how we feel what we do is validated. And in terms of SoTL, I know Mel and I have had conversations over the last few years about this in particular within our institution. So research is a huge part of our overall mission. However, SoTL, and this is when we get into, and I don't mean to steer the conversation in this way, but this is where we can get into the nexus between research and teaching, research into teaching, and where in this so-called hierarchy might this type of research, where does SoTL fit within that? How is it perceived by colleagues? How is it perceived by those who are in positions of power vis-a-vis tenure and promotions committees and such? And from my experience and observations through conversations and different things as a developer, I've seen this being validated in different ways in different departments and across different faculties in our campuses. So there's there's never a sort of one size fits all model. So I don't know where it said faculty or university, in my context, instructor, is going to be sort of fitting within this so-called contextual environment. How are they going to be perceived by their peers and these people in positions of power? My job, regardless of that, is to support them through a process, and therefore to help them find the joy and for them to find the meaning through evidence to support what they're doing or to refute what they're doing in their classroom, and therefore enable them to learn from themselves, reflect on it, and provide a better learning experience, a better environment for their students. And again, when I say better, we can define that in lots of different ways too, but maybe more positive. The learning environment is more enhanced, and being able to do that and having the evidence come back to me in terms of what their successes are or where their failures were, and sort of bridging that gap too, is pretty awesome as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Mandy. And Mandy, so what is a Joy Quotient, and what is more specifically your Joy Quotient then as it relates to SoTL?
So this is awesome. So the Joy Quotient, when I think about Joy Quotient, so I think there's life joy, and then there's different places where I think sometimes we more actively have to seek out the joy in our lives. So sometimes that's at home. You're feeling overwhelmed, and maybe without sort of a sense of false positivity, but sometimes maybe thinking through some of the challenges that you might be experiencing is, okay, well, what's actually going well, and trying to focus on that to bring mentally, emotionally yourself out of whatever you might be feeling. And I think we've all been experiencing that in a variety of different ways lately, but this isn't just about what's been happening lately or since we were sent home because of the crisis. This isn't particular to the crisis. This is just how I tend to think through and process a lot of the information when things are going wrong through work. So either I'm not achieving what I was hoping or intending to, or if, for example, in supporting faculty, using the example I had used just a moment ago, where perhaps the work that they're doing is so important and so full of meaning for them, but it's not sticking or it doesn't have a place of landing with those who they immediately work with. So being able to support that and provide some of that joy for them is hugely important. And therefore, in turn, I mean, it's a selfish thing because I get joy out of that. So the joy quotient for me is about seeking out what are those moments or what are those things, undefinable sometimes things that bring you joy. For some, it's having a passion project. So there's a lot of there's a lot of work that I don't love this, but as a part of my role, I'm obligated to fulfill this or write this project or engage in this particular way. I'm going to do it. I don't love it. But here's another part of my portfolio. For me, it's the SoTL piece where I know it's going to bring joy. It's going to bring challenge, but that's where I get the most joy. And so that's my daily, SoTL joy quotient is when I can have time to invest and sort of play and engage through this area.
And Melanie, could you explain a little bit more about what it means to you and what your joy quotient is?
I think one of the things, and it's interesting because had you asked this question like a year ago, we might have answered it a tiny bit different than we would now, except for that, of course, everybody who knows me knows like I love SoTL more than anything. So if you ask me about SoTL, I'll talk about it for hours. It's probably a mistake if you want to ask me, because I can go on and on and on. But I think one of the things I've learned this year, and kind of Mandy already alluded to it, is to celebrate the little wins and not to think in absolutes. So we don't have to do everything, and we don't have to do nothing. There's a continuum in the middle that we have to strive for, and we have to give ourselves patience and grace, not only ourselves, but the people around us, that they might not be able to do their everything or their nothing in the same day. And by kind of putting that frame of mind together and celebrating those little wins, or what can we do today kind of philosophy, which is what I talk to my team a lot about, is what are we capable of doing today? And if we get there, great. And if we don't, we still have tomorrow. So part of that joy is just to show people that we don't always have to be perfect all of the time, which then translates, I think, into our SoTL projects as we're doing them. And we've kind of talked about successes and failures often. And I've been to a number of SoTL conferences where they're actually presenting on a failure, which gives me joy because in disciplines, we can't do that. And so in my nursing discipline, there'd be no way I would go up in front of an audience and say, I had an idea and it failed. But in the SoTL world, and the SoTL community is so celebratory and so all-encompassing to support you, that if you have a bad idea or you had an idea and it didn't go so well, that you're going to have a whole community giving you ideas of how it could go better or how you think it could go better. And I think relying on your SoTL people, wherever they may be in your SoTL world, is a part of where the joy is, because it's finally a place where you can feel free to fail, succeed, and connect with all these other people who are willing to fail and succeed. So that's part of my joy quotient for sure. And then the other part is getting to meet people you never would have got to meet had we not been on this SoTL journey across the country. And one thing you'll find if you're new to SoTL is you'll have a lot of SoTL best friends within a week of starting the SoTL project. So just know that we're all around you to help you to succeed in your SoTL project.
Perfect. And we're going to get back into that discussion of community in just a second, but I do want to ask Pat to explain a little bit about his joy quotient.
Yeah, and I can almost, go between the two questions here. So for me, my joy quotient and the way that I look at it is a bit, it comes from the discipline. So my background is in outdoor education, and we like to talk about risk management, right? Like we need to make sure that like we're we're not going to put any kids at risk, and we want to make sure we've dotted the I's and crossed the T's. And I often like to think about it in the flip side, right? That's the joy management. What are we losing if we just put all these constraints on things, all these rules, and really stunt people's creativity, right? So this is far before the pandemic ever came along, but it was just sort of like that growth mindset, seeing the best in everything. And now that we're in the pandemic, we sort of have the doom and gloom side of things, and then we have the toxic positivity where it's like everything's going to be awesome, right, from the Lego movie. And I feel like all along, for me, it was about riding that balance. It was being open and transparent and, being okay to show our flaws and our weaknesses, but still striving to do things that are, better than before and be creative. And I have one example, but maybe I'll leave that for the next question.
Well, Pat, I will pose the next question to you first, and that is, how does your SoTL work influence your board and community and external work? And for those who are joining the call who might not be familiar with all these acronyms, maybe we could just explain and situate ourselves as like what EDC is or what STLHE is. Pat, you.
Sounds good. So the way that I see SoTL is really pretty broad, as has already been indicated. It's not just research, it's research, and that's informing teaching, and it relates to the service roles that you might take on as a faculty member or as a student. And for me, one of those service commitments is that I chair the 3M Council. So that's the Council of National Teaching and National Student Fellows, having received a 3M National Teaching Fellowship in 2014. And I think for me, where that sort of overlapped with how I see joy and how I choose to sort of live my best possible teaching life is working with colleagues within that. So I'll just give one example, and that's about 3 years ago. I worked with some other 3M National Teaching Fellows, Billy Streen, Kim Brooks, Allison Flynn, and we gave a presentation called 3M Train Wrecks, right? And it was simply to say, look, we don't get everything right. We've been the recipients of a wonderful award that says we're probably pretty good at teaching, but it doesn't always happen like that, and it certainly doesn't often start out like that. So if you're interested in this, we gave a presentation at the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Ed conference, but there's also a journal article that we wrote for the collected essays on learning and teaching, the CELT publication, and it just lays bare that sometimes when I take students on amazing field courses down the Stikine River, I come pretty close to possibly having students die. And when Allison Flynn decides, let's do a Wordle so that we can showcase what we've learned in chemistry, and all of a sudden the word penis blows up on the screen, like these are some train wrecks that 3M National Teaching Fellows have stumbled into, and hopefully we've learned something from those. And so I think that's where the connection between joy, between taking risks, and between being creative and open come in contact.
Thanks, Pat. And Melanie, you also spoke a little bit about the roles that you serve on externally. So if you could talk a little bit about how your SoTL work influences that community work and how those work in tandem.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. So I'm the chair of SoTL Canada. So our kind of mandate at SoTL Canada is to kind of get a community of people together across Canada. And so we're a constituency group under the Society for Teaching, Learning, Higher Education. And so our focus is kind of more specifically on the SoTL itself, and is to try to really connect people together who are doing SoTL projects. We want to help people contribute to SoTL. We're encouraging people to publish in our Canadian Journal for the Society of Teaching and Learning, which is the journal for STELI. And one of the things that we've done in the last couple of years for SoTL Canada is to reach out to our regional partners and create regional subgroups. And the reason we did that was because Canada is a vast landmass, and we're not all close together. And sometimes it's hard to collaborate with people in different provinces due to different time zones and the way that our education system might be provincially. So we've created 8 SoTL Canada groups from BC all the way to Atlantic Canada. And what we're trying to do is encourage like-minded people to get together and share their own SoTL experiences, and then bring people into the community of SoTL who are unsure if they want to join or unsure what SoTL is. Lots of people have never heard of SoTL. The other thing we're trying to do is support SoTL with accreditations. There's a lot of provincial bodies that have to report on SoTL to get their accreditations. So we're also trying to support people who are in the process of getting accreditation for their institution if they don't know how to write about SoTL. So that's part of the umbrella of SoTL Canada. This year particularly, we're doing 2 huge initiatives, and I hope that everybody will become a SoTL member so that you can be a part of our group and to take advantage. But we're going to start creating one-pagers on how to start a SoTL project. So every month we're going to release a one-pager on the research process for SoTL, and we have the SoTL Roadshow, and we're going to do a monthly webinar attached to that one-pager for people so that they can have like the step-by-step process of kind of starting the research project or doing research questions, all the way up to the dissemination when we all get back together and have our wonderful conferences again. So SoTL Canada is here for you, and you can reach out to any of our board members and we'd be happy to support you.
Thank you. And lastly, over to you, Mandy.
Okay, so I want to preface how I'm going to answer this question by saying that SoTL and how I've defined, conceived of SoTL, it is the foundation to everything that I try to do within my role. And the way I've had the best success in terms of the support and facilitating particular processes related to SoTL and otherwise has been through peer-based communities. And so developing peer-based communities and encouraging these communities once built to grow and develop and then sustain. And so therefore, not only is there reciprocity in terms of the relationships that are built, but there's also mentoring in terms of as people are newly coming into these communities, there are people who are already well versed, perhaps well known across the institution. And then there, again, it filters back into this sort of this reciprocal mentoring support process. So that's the preface. So in terms of my community work, I'm a former chair of the Council of Ontario Educational Developers, and I'm a current, this is my last year, but Educational Developers Caucus Secretary. And so the Educational Developers Caucus, I'll start off with that one. That is basically, it's our national body of educational developers. So it's pretty simple to understand in terms of sort of the so-called members and whom you would most likely find at one of our conferences and across our membership. So developers, but teaching and learning center directors. Sometimes we have AVP teaching and learning. There's a lot of graduate students, people who are involved in some capacity in the support of teaching and learning work across our institutions. The Council of Ontario Educational Developers is a provincial body. We are not directly affiliated with the EDC, the Educational Developers Caucus, but it's a similar sort of thing, but it's more of a provincial voice, what's happening, what's local, how do we make meaning of what's being filtered down onto us at a provincial level. So I talk about these two roles in particular because across both, and my secretary role within the EDC has kind of been, it's been interesting too, because it's not been just about logistical information and recording minutes and things. I've had a lot of sort of space and scope to do some fun things, and again, fulfilling some of that joy quotient as far as I can see it. So bringing people together, what might that look like? So facilitating groups, and when I say facilitating, putting a process in place where people can come together to talk, to share ideas, and this I connect back to sort of the foundational principles of SoTL. So when we say sort of making appropriately public, at what level? It might be within a very small community level. It might be across a provincial level or across a national body. How are these conversations how are they being activated? How are the opportunities being developed and organized? And then therefore, how are these relationships being, when I say facilitated, made possible, so that way people can come together and talk about the things that are most on their heart. And again, based on my capacity with teaching and learning, more often than not, these conversations are to do with teaching and learning, with pedagogy, with supporting students, student learning, etc., and so forth. So while I think it's fair to say it's not direct outwardly SoTL, you wouldn't go and read about this per se. It's out there. You do have to look. But it's the activities and I think the opportunities that have allowed or are allowing for SoTL work to continue. And that's I think the biggest part of the SoTL in connection to my role within these boards.
Perfect. And obviously, there's no one on this call who is a stranger to the fact that higher education has shifted dramatically since the onset of the pandemic. So I will ask you, Pat, how has the pandemic affected your SoTL work?
Well, I mean, I think it's sort of changed, and so maybe I'll speak to this like here's how it looked in March, and here's how it looks in August. I think in March, in my role as a university administrator, and in trying to build this like teaching hub that was a month old, and encourage SoTL and other teaching supports at an institution where I was only 5 months into my job. I mean, it basically threw everything out the window, as it did for everyone else on all other fronts, right? Like the pandemic came along, and I feel like for March and for April, I was just treading water, barely keeping my head above the water, and really just trying to figure out how can we keep these things going, right? How can we keep the institution going? How can we keep teaching going, etc. But at the end of the day, I feel like the pandemic has really affected my SoTL work, but also my work in much more general sense as a catalyst, right? Like for me, the pandemic has now sort of opened some doors that I thought might take 5 years to get opened, right? It's allowed some collaboration, which I feel is a part of SoTL. It's allowed for some collaboration to really take 12 steps forward, right? Where I thought we might be at a place a few years from now, we're there today. Within my institution, it's also been a catalyst for some hiring in this area, right? Like many I see online on Facebook or on various listservs, all the doom and gloom of like cuts to faculty positions, to SoTL related positions, to Center for Teaching and Learning. I do see increases there, but most of them are like 18-month contract and things like that. But for me, it's been a catalyst to we really need to resource our teaching hub, and we need to do so in a very concerted, strategic way, and we need to do it on a sustainable way. So it's full-time positions and things like that. So it's been the pandemic initially was very scary. Oh my gosh, what do we do? Now it's moved to cool. It's a bit of a catalyst for some things that are better off than I could have expected, given the newness of the teaching hub and the newness of my role at Nipissing University. And I think also one of the things that the pandemic has done, and I'll quote Jessica Riddell on this, right? It's allowed me to make things a lot more relationship rich, and allowed me to build off of, some of the great collaborations that I had, just coming together with those colleagues and maybe not discussing anything related to our work, but having wonderful catch-ups. How are things going in Australia? How are things going in Norway? What's new in Ireland? And how can we learn from that? So building some of those relationships and really connecting with those colleagues way more often now in the midst of a pandemic than I might have done under normal circumstances and things like that.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think even the nature of this event maybe would not have reached as many people pre-pandemic. Over to
Yeah.
you, Mel. How has the pandemic affected your SoTL work?
So I think probably like everybody, it's made us pause some of our research for now some of our research unfortunately has to have gone on the back burner like others working in the Center for Teaching and Learning. It's really made it that we've had to help our faculty first and then kind of go back to our SoTL research second. One of the things I noticed was that with our SoTL researchers, a lot of them were using students to finish their research projects, and so a lot of our researchers had their studies interrupted this year because they were all at that data collection phase when students went home. So sitting down with them and saying, okay, what can we do with the project that you have? What can be put off? How can we change things into a different type of project if we need to? And trying to problem solve. So I spent probably quite a bit of time in the spring problem solving our active SoTL researchers to finish out their program in their best way, while also trying to help our researchers who were going to be applying for their grants and asking them, or I had quite a few of those researchers coming to me saying, is it still worth me doing my application if I'm not going to have students online in class in the fall? So kind of coming up with those creative ways of how can we do different types of SoTL projects and still get to the information that to answer the question they're asking. So those were the big starts for us. And then of course, then thinking every time I'm at a meeting now and people are talking about what's going good and what's not going so good, in my mind, I put my SoTL hat on. I'm like, oh, well, that could be a SoTL research project and this could be a SoTL research project. So I've got about 25 new research projects I'd like to start based on some of the experiences that we've had in the past 4 months.
Thanks, Mel. And Mandy, in your role, how has the pandemic affected your work?
So I'm going to ask everybody's forgiveness because I'm going to be incredibly blunt and brutally honest, but this is only from my own experience. So I felt from March till maybe recently, and I'm saying recently as the last few weeks even, so well into the summer, SoTL basically stopped. Again, so this is my own experience, but in no way meaning to undermine anybody else's. The lines between professional and personal have been completely blurred. In March and April, I was just kind of happy to have two young children home alive and more or less happy, if not a little bit bored. But then they too had to learn about online learning and what that would look like. And let me tell you, having a kindergarten, an SK student learning how to do online learning, that's really fun to support in the moment and then be in meetings. And there were two of us home. I'm lucky to have a spouse at home who could also take on some of this load, who I also know this is not the case for everyone. So because of this, because of what I felt I was trying to handle and accomplish, my investment in SoTL it plummeted, and it's not because there was a lack of love. It was because there was a lack of being able to attune to it. Our center, like other centers, all of a sudden, those of us who previously did not support e-learning, online learning, blended learning, whatever your institution calls it. So we did call it e-learning, and now I think we are calling it teaching remotely, and then this is also going to change again. However, that's totally fine. But for somebody like me who had some background in supporting that's not been my portfolio. So now I've been trying to learn how to do some of these things in order to support others so that they can do that with their students. And that was pretty huge. And therefore, at that point, would I have even encouraged, first of all, would I have had the mindset to say, okay, I'm going to start a SoTL project right now? No, absolutely not. And so would I encourage somebody else to be doing that who was feeling maybe some of the same pressures, stress, feelings of being overwhelmed? Absolutely not. And that's more of a survival, mental health, well-being kind of a place. Do what you need to do. What is your priority right now? Is it learning how to do something online? Is it learning how to manage conversations online? Whatever it is, let's learn how to do that first. Maybe later there's an opportunity, and these are starting to come up now. So you're going to be trying this for the first time. Should we maybe collect some evidence and see what happens? And something very small scale but achievable. Up until a very few years ago at York, SoTL was not something that those letters were never put together ever. You never had an SoTL, so a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning meant very little to even fewer. My mandate has been to try to change that, and I've had increasing success over the last few years. So my fear related to this pandemic and how it's affecting the work, the courses and the initiatives that I'm doing, they are still on offer, but they too will look differently. I'm afraid as a result of that, those key connections and those key learnings and the key support systems that have been in place are not going to work as well. And there's nothing I can do about that except try really hard and celebrate the successes when there are some, and celebrate the failures when there are some of those too. However, I don't know. And so part of how this is affecting my SoTL work is it's made me really anxious about SoTL within my institution and about how I encourage people to do SoTL. I don't want it to be the so-called, straw and camel and such. I'm trying to be very conscientious of people's overall well-being and commitment to what can we actually do for now. So that was really long-winded, but anyways, that's my story with this question.
And I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit more because you talked about the significant challenges and the significant opportunities that the shift to online or remote or e-learning has brought to collecting evidence for SoTL. So as the future of work and things continue to remain online, what is your blue sky vision for these SoTL supports that would encourage folks to try this out, maybe for the first time or to enhance or deepen their practice? So Mandy, I'll put that on you first.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Thanks. Okay, so this is in terms of the course and going forward, as I said, it will look differently. That doesn't mean that it's going to be bad different. It means I don't know. So when I talk about my anxieties in this way, I don't know that it's going to have any kind of negative consequences. To put a different spin on it, it provides opportunities to gain some institutional-based evidence in ways that we've not been able to ever have collected it before. There are studies that can emerge now that could never have emerged before. And what might those constructs, learning, whatever theories, thoughts, reflections, how might that contribute as we continue? We know that we're not going to be teaching like this forever. However, I think we also know, I think we can safely say now, we will never be teaching like we did before. And I'm hearing, I don't mean, it's not just going to be all face-to-face, and it's not just going to be all online. The future of teaching is going to look differently, and I think how we approach it, we will be thinking about it differently as well. So this can breathe brand new life into our SoTL work. And so, yeah, I don't mean to imply bad. I'm fearful. However, that doesn't mean that there are not opportunities. I think the biggest factor for me will be when to start to, again, to raise the level of encouragement and to broaden my own horizons, and then as well as what we're capable of within within our time going forward.
And Melanie, I will ask you the same question of what's your vision for SoTL and the associated supports that are necessary as we continue to work and shift our work into this online sphere?
I think one of the biggest opportunities I see is greater collaboration across Canada. Whereas before we might not have thought to connect on Zoom or Teams or Blue Jean or whatever platform, it's become commonplace for us now. So we can be reaching out to a broader group of people to collaborate with or to bounce ideas off of. So that would be like my one big celebration. And I think too, as we connect across Canada and internationally, we'll also find that people know people. So if you have a really good idea, but you don't know, you want a collaborative partner or you want someone to bounce ideas off of by kind of asking people in the community who also has like-mindedness. If we don't know the answer, I'm sure someone that we know does know the answer. So it's kind of becoming serendipitous in some ways, that these partnerships might kind of happen organically and naturally, which we never would have had the time to do before because we were in class all the time or doing different projects. But now that we've been forced to slow down, I've talked to quite a few people who have said, kind of like, finally, I have a chance to do my SoTL project, which I might not have before, or I have a really good idea that I want to try. And now that I have some time to think about it, maybe SoTL is a really good way to get that idea out to other people. So I think the biggest thing for me from the blue sky perspective, like you say, Heather, is taking the time to seek out those opportunities, or to ask people to help you seek out those opportunities. Because now that we're in an environment that we're doing things that everybody always said we couldn't do, work at home, have more online learning, there's going to be a really rich opportunity for our scholars and our scholarly thinkers to get some of that research into publication, so that we can show and demonstrate that there are a variety of ways that we can teach that were never thought possible.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mel. And last but not least, Pat, what about you from your perspective and your role?
Well, I think from my perspective, there's four different points that I wanted to make, not to sort of necessarily echo what Mandy and Mel have already said, but to offer some differentiation. I think from my perspective, what I'm trying to do as a dean is encourage like small scale SoTL, and what I mean by that is simply the critical reflection that an instructor does, whereby, okay, I used to teach this course face to face. Here's how I did it. Now I've tried to do it this way because I'm forced by the pandemic to go online, and I'm taking some lessons from that, right? Hopefully folks teach the fall and look at what they've done in the same course that they taught for 10 years face to face and see some good in some of the new ways that they did things. They got more comfortable with their LMS. They realized that they could do assessment completely differently with the online capabilities that we now have in the 21st century. And they're not just when this is all over, and I know that we don't know if and when that will ever happen, they don't just slip back to what they did before, right? So the critical reflection that says, I'm going to get some lessons from what I was forced into in terms of a change in modality. I think, when we talk about collaboration, I think in my role it's supporting, but also engaging with some larger collaborative studies around topics that we probably had on the back burner that weren't rising up, like equity in the learning environment, right? So we weren't talking a whole lot about like whether or not students have access to Wi-Fi and things like that until we were all forced to teach online, and that was an issue for faculty, for students, etc. So I think there's some larger collaborative studies, pan-Canadian or international, that are starting to take shape. And the timing of those is now, I think, finally appropriate, because I think some SoTL work really did have to fall off the table when faculty were stressed, students were stressed at the beginning, at the outset of the pandemic. And now that hasn't totally cleared, but I think, as we move into the fall, then some of those studies can start taking shape. And I think the last point that I want to make around SoTL is that whatever we get out of research and scholarship that happens during pandemic, during COVID-19 times, we shouldn't use as the baseline for all online learning. Like, there's a ton of literature and a ton of scholarship that's happened for the last 20 or 30 years that supports best practices for online learning. And we shouldn't take what we learn right now as to be new best practices or throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because what's happening right now is so different from typical traditional online learning. It's the remote teaching, emergency measures. We had to shift courses online with 3 days notice in March and with 3 months notice for the fall, that we have to be careful, and we have to put that caveat that this is different.
Thanks so much, and I totally agree with everyone's sentiments.